Hey guys, it's Adam from Robotpencil and welcome back. I'd like to do things a little differently today. Instead of sharing my thoughts and feelings on a predetermined topic that I come up with myself, I would instead like today's vigil, today's art talk, to be an extension, a continuation of an amazing conversation I had with one of my students this week, who had asked me a question from a place of great authenticity. Her question was, and of course I'm paraphrasing here, from your perspective, from your place in life right now as a professional artist, what are your feelings about the future of art careers in the face of AI art? And she went on to elaborate. She added to that, most of the artists, the well-established artists that I see online that are also YouTubers, don't necessarily make a living selling art specifically. And that was the observation she had shared with me, the thought that she had shared with me that tipped me off to her source. And I really appreciated the fact that she asked me specifically, because that allowed me to dig deeper into a subject that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to during our 2-hour session together. But we went quite deep down the rabbit hole with this. So I paused for a moment and I realized the more I thought, before I answered, the more I realized I had to dig deeper and deeper and deeper into not only my past, but into my family's past, and into a little bit of art history. Not that I'm an art historian by any stretch. History was always a subject I sucked at. But I realized I had to dig into the history of art and the lives and the careers of artists over the centuries. So let me take you back. If we go back a couple of hundred years, actually, if we go back to the 19th century, meaning the 1800s, between 1801 and 1899, before the turn of the century into the 1900s, we had artists, very well known and very employable artists like John Singer Sargent and William Bouguereau, to name a few. Two artists that had similarities in the subject that they painted, being people, and in many ways realistic depictions of people, although they had very differing styles. Sargent was much looser and much more painterly and suggestive, where Bouguereau was very much a hyper-realist who would capture every finite detail down to the shadow between the eyelid and the eyeball, or the reflection on the ivory portion of a woman's silver and ivory earring. There were differences. Sargent was very often commissioned by noblemen, by aristocrats, by rich folk, politicians, to paint portraiture, to capture their likeness. Whereas Bouguereau, although he did do portraiture as well, and very excellent portraiture on top of it, his paintings were very often had more of a narrative aspect to it, very often a fantastical aspect of it. He would paint religious narratives, or he would paint people in certain scenarios where it wasn't so much about the individual, more as their character, their performance. And if you study enough of Bouguereau's paintings, you'll see that Bouguereau painted very often the same model numerous times, sometimes even numerous times in the same painting from multiple different angles, whereas Sargent would paint individuals more frequently, at least through most of the period of his career up until the turn of the 20th century, when things started to change. What made John Singer Sargent a very hireable and very popular portrait artist back during the prime of his career through the mid to late 1800s. It wasn't only his ability to paint people well. It wasn't only in his technical execution, although technically he was exceptional, and he's an artist to this day that many of us artists, myself included, and artists like Ahmed Aldoori and Clint Cearley and so on, have studied in depth due to his exceptional technique. However, that's not why he got hired so frequently. This wasn't one of the main reasons why he was so sought after as an artist. Firstly, one of the reasons why he was so valuable as a portrait artist was because this was pre-photography. These were the years, the 1800s, all the way up until the turn of the 1800s until the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, photography either didn't exist or wasn't yet commercially available to the general consumer. It was just a new invention, a novelty that was being experimented with. Photography was being invented during that period. So an artist like Sargent and their ability to be able to capture the likeness of an individual was a very, very sought after skill, because without portraiture, without portrait artistry, a person's likeness would die off. It would cease to exist after that person passed away. So an artist's ability to immortalize a person's likeness, particularly a person of high status, a duke, a duchess, an aristocrat, etc., a tycoon, was something that people really, really valued and paid handsomely for, and put a lot of pressure on an artist to be able to do well. So the fact that he painted portraiture was important, and his technical skill was also equally important for him to execute something that was skillfully done, but that again was not the reason why he was so employable. If you study Sargent's paintings beyond his technique, what you come to realize, what you come to learn, once you look past the paint and look past the subject, is the likeness at which Sargent captured that individual. Meaning, what personality, what traits, what qualities did Sargent focus on, idealize, and or discreetly hide or disguise to protect that person's sense of self, to protect that person's ego? And when you look at it through that lens, when you look at the painting of that war veteran, if you look at the painting of that duchess, if you look at the painting of that beautiful woman sitting in her chair with her best dress on some beautiful embroidered couch with her hair all done up, wearing her best jewelry, if you analyze the way Sargent captured the light across her face, or what angle of her he captured, or her position on that canvas, her pose, her personality, you realize he wasn't only good at capturing her likeness, he was good at capturing her ego. He was good at capturing his ego. The men with highlights and high contrast on the badges on his lapel, the squareness of his hairline, the way the light would capture his face and sculpt him in a very masculine way, the way the brass tip of his cane caught the light, or the way the shine on his freshly polished shoes caught a reflection in the shadows. Or maybe that woman didn't have a perfect profile. Maybe her nose was a little bit big compared to what was celebrated at the time. He would have the light catch her face in a way that didn't hide the profile of her nose, but would cloak it in light, reducing the contrast on her cheek and her nose so they blended in together, just catching a strong shadow under it to take emphasis off of it, and then put a strong, piercing, high contrast eyelash on her and piercing eyes that would draw your gaze to her eyes, her beautiful eyes, and not so much on a feature she might feel self-conscious about. And he did this time and time again. Sargent's gift was not only in his technical ability. Sargent's gift was his empathy. Sargent's gift was his insight into the needs of others. And he, I would argue, is one of the purest examples of an artist. You can imagine, he sold his paintings to the wealthy. But he wasn't the only one. There were many like him. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of other portrait artists that would love to be in his position, but they weren't necessarily. He just happened to be at the right place at the right time and had the right skill that the right people wanted to pay him for. And throughout most of his career, that's what he did. Bouguereau, on the other hand, painted fantastical scenes and narratives in incredible technical skill. He didn't do portraiture as much as he would produce beautiful, elaborate, sometimes massive paintings for wealthy collectors, for people who purchased art specifically. So if his paintings did not necessarily capture their likeness or the likeness of specific individuals, people were employing and paying Bouguereau for his imagination, for his depiction of the world around him. In the case of both Bouguereau and Sargent, they painted idealized versions of people. But they weren't the only ones. What if you looked at a painter like Rembrandt, for instance? Rembrandt was quite the opposite. Rembrandt didn't paint idealized paintings. In fact, idealizing people was something he was almost allergic to. Even in his self-portraits, every pimple, every broken blood vessel, every bit of rosacea on the face, every receding hairline, every moment of weakness, he captured with as much honesty, almost brutal honesty, that he could. Sure, he did beautiful paintings, but his focus was really on the rawness of real life. He wanted you to look into the eyes of his model. He wanted you to look at somebody and feel a human looking back at you. Not an idealized human, a real human, in their naked truth, so to speak. I would almost equate that to the Ricky Gervais of stand-up comedy. Ricky Gervais doesn't mince words. He doesn't pretend that people are something that they're not. They don't try to flatter through their comedy. They don't try to necessarily create relatability through little silly things that we forget to laugh at the way other comedians might. He doesn't play it safe. He says, no, the world is ugly. This person is exploiting everybody. He just says it like it is. Something that everybody thinks, but everybody's afraid to say. Not to mean that he's not sensitive and very, very careful and scripted about what he does, but he likes to look at the world through the lens of truth. Was he hired for that? Was he employed as much as perhaps Sargent or Bouguereau were? Not necessarily. But his clientele, the people who gravitated towards his artistry, were people who were attracted to the raw truth. Collectors who were very impressed by his ability to remove ego from life and see it through a very clear lens. Now, the 1900s happen, and somewhere around the early 1900s, let's say around 1904, 1905, very early on before the 1910s, photography officially becomes mainstream. I think it was around 1900 on the nose, if I'm not mistaken. Is it any coincidence that by 1905, Sargent publicly decides to hang up his paintbrushes and stop doing commissions? He quit. Why? Well, because photography, at least he felt, replaced the portrait artist in most part. A lot of artists back in the day had the belief, if you can see it with your own eyes, what's the point of painting it? The whole purpose, the whole idea behind art is to capture life through the lens that the human eye can't. It's capturing the essence, the energy, an abstraction of reality. They devalued Bouguereau. Now, of course, Bouguereau, I believe, died in 1907. I might be getting these dates wrong. So he didn't live long enough to see how photography impacted the art world. Thankfully to him, probably. But Sargent was. And he made his decision. He chose a path away from portrait art. Whether it was directly related to photography or not, there's a hell of a coincidence going on there, isn't there? Now, remember, just to kind of package all of this, here comes my cat, Gimli. Remember, we're still long away from artificial intelligence. We're still a great distance away from computers or internet or even phones at this point. We don't even have modems yet, okay? So remember, we are a far cry from where we are today. Now, let's fast forward. The 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s come and go. Painters are still painters. Artists are still artists. Yes, things have evolved. Yes, trends change and they come and go. But people are still painting. Artists continue to exist. And you know what? Portrait artists continue to exist as well. And we find ourselves at the late 1960s and then into the 1970s. And there's a young woman, a mother of three, a fine artist, married to a fine artist man, who, with their combined incomes, have a home together and have 3 young children together. However, he decides to leave and abandons this woman with 3 children who she now has to raise on her own, and she has nothing but a fine art degree. And if anybody have listened to my art talks in the past, you might already know who I'm referring to. But to those who are new to this or haven't heard me talk about this before, I'm referring to my mother, Anne Duff. She is a single woman in the 1970s with 3 young kids, and all she has is a fine art degree, which even back in the 1970s was the equivalent of absolutely nothing. How would an artist, how would a woman like her, with the education and the skill that she had, make a living as an artist back in the 1970s? Well, she could try to sell her oil paintings, narrative paintings, portrait paintings, whatever type of artwork that she produced. She would need to sell it. Who would she sell it to? Perhaps there would be collectors that would be interested in her style of artwork, but what she produced was fairly niche. So she wasn't providing it as a service. She was providing her artwork. She was selling her artwork as a product. She could sell it to clients. She could sell it to collectors. Hopefully she could find a collector who would pay her for it and pay her consistently for it, but that's not realistic, is it? It's not realistic to expect one wealthy person to fund your life and raise your kids. That doesn't make sense. They're going to run out of walls to hang your paintings on eventually. That's not sustainable. The other option would be to set up a gallery and have customers walk in and out, have a vernissage, set it up in a gallery and have people walk in and hopefully like their artwork enough to pay for it and walk out with a canvas of their own. Again, She has no way of knowing what people's desires are. She has no way of knowing who's going to walk in and spot her paintings on the side of the road and have enough money and desire to walk in and purchase something for themselves. Now, sometimes galleries could offer you some kind of a forward, some kind of a financial investment. But usually when a gallery would hire you, and that continues to this day, if a gallery is going to hire you for a collection that they're going to showcase in their gallery, then usually you can't just walk in with one or two pieces. Usually there's a collection and there's a minimum number of paintings that you need to produce. And producing those paintings can take months, if not years. You're going to have to sustain yourself. You're going to have to make a living. So a lot of artists would work in restaurants. They would have side hustles. Same thing artists do nowadays. My daughter is a trained artist and illustrator, but she still works in a restaurant to help pay her bills. It's very normal. That's what I did. I worked as a waiter. I worked in phone customer service. I did what I needed to do to pay the bills while I was in school and trying to make a name for myself. And that's what she did. But when you've got 3 kids and a mortgage and a car that you have to pay for, and you have to take your kids to soccer practice and hockey practice and to their events and to their school things, and they have school fees to pay for, and there's nobody helping you, do you think you can have a stable lifestyle? Do you think you can do all of that and support all of that by selling the random painting to hopeful passers-by on the street? Of course not. So she did what she had to do. She set up a canvas, a white canvas. She grabbed a paintbrush and black paint, and she sketched a witch's cauldron with 3 sets of legs sticking out of it, symbolizing her 3 kids that she would be boiling alive if she decided to continue down this path. And that painting symbolized her giving up on art, sacrificing her art career so she could go back to school and get a degree in something that would help her raise a family on her own. And that she did. She went back to school and she got a degree in computer science, and she even had to finish her high school math just to qualify. But there she was, one of only 2 women, her and her friend Karen, in a classroom with, I imagine, hundreds of men, being the only 2 women in this entire class, got herself a degree in computer science and ended up getting a job as a computer scientist. Now, she made the gesture of quitting art, of giving it up. But as irony would have it, art ended up finding her. Because when she was working at a company as a programmer, a company called Sperry, which I believe was also called Unisys, if my memory served me well. I would have been around 10 or 11 at the time. And Sperry no longer exists. It was sold or bought off by some other company back in the 1980s, like around 1985 or 86. Now I believe Sperry is some sport shoes brand or something like that, if I'm not mistaken. She was working at this company as a computer programmer, but they needed somebody to produce this new, really interesting thing called computer graphics. They had this software where people could produce artwork using vector graphics. And, well, her company was full of programmers. Nobody knew how to produce any imagery. Nobody had any artistic skill. Since my mother had a fine arts degree and a computer science degree, she was given the task of designing an upfront control panel for a flight simulator or something like that. And what she produced on that computer, what she designed on the computer, ended up on the front page of a magazine. And the title of the magazine, believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, if you want a little moment in history here, courtesy Ann Duff, the front cover showcased her artwork, and the title was, quote, "This was done on a computer." Because nobody had ever seen anything like that before. I mean, now computer graphics is everywhere and all over the place. Computer graphics is the standard nowadays. But back then, it was unheard of. It was a moment in time in history where art and science met at a crossroads. And I remember her telling me stories about when she was studying fine arts at Concordia University in Montreal. When she would study fine arts, the fine arts department was at the opposite end of the hall, at the far opposite end as the computer science department. And when she was a member of the fine arts department, her and all of her artist friends would glance at the opposite end of the hallway with looks of utter disgust. And they would say, "Oh my God, look at those geeks. Jesus," with their pocket protectors and their white shirts and their crew cuts. But then fast forward a couple of decades later, and there she was at the opposite end of the hallway, mingling with the computer scientists. And she laughed she laughed when all of her computer science peers glanced over at the fine artists and said, "Ugh, look at all those fucking hippies. Take a bath." You know? And she had that had been her reality back then. It's kind of funny. Well, here she is, literally at the very crossroads where art and science meet. And she continued on this path through a career working on flight simulators, becoming a team leader, working at big companies, multi-million-dollar projects for companies like Bombardier, where they produced flight simulators to train pilots. She even had a chance to share the table and work on a project side by side with the legend Dr. Ballard. One of my personal favorite human beings on the planet, one of the most inspiring people I know. Dr. Ballard is the individual, the sea captain, who discovered the Titanic. She worked with him, and he's apparently as awesome and inspiring and wonderful a person in real life as he is in public, or at least what I've seen of him in TED Talks and documentaries and things like that. That was her opportunity. That was her life. This was the life that her choice granted her. Did she regret quitting art? No, because art kept finding her over and over again. And furthermore, what she kept discovering time and time again, and the reality I was raised on by her, was you can never take the artist away from the artist. You can never take the art away. It's always there. Just because she wasn't physically painting something every day, she thought like an artist. She created in her mind like an artist. She saw like an artist. She expressed like an artist. She dressed like an artist. She decorated her home like an artist. The art was in her DNA. Her job had no impact on the artist that she was. So there was no regret. There was no fear. There was no loss. And the millisecond that she retired, she immediately converted the bottom floor of her home into an art gallery, and she's produced painting after painting after painting since. It's as if her artist wheels never stopped spinning. She just lifted the wheels off the ground for a couple of decades, and the minute she laid her wheel back down on the ground, she took off at full speed. Never lost a moment of momentum. And every time I turn my head and I look back at her gallery, she's got another 20 paintings sitting there, and they're as wonderful as ever. Now, the story doesn't end there, because she's found her path, she's found her way, but I hadn't yet. I was still a young aspiring artist with a desire to be a traditional Disney artist, a story I've told multiple times, and the tools at which I used to produce my art was a blue pencil, a graphite pencil, and white paper, an animation desk. And everything was done entirely traditionally. And when I went to school, I originally studied fine arts in college and then followed that up with a degree in classical film animation at Concordia University, decades later. Same school, different artist, different aspirations, and everything I did was traditional. We used an Oxbury camera or a Bolex camera to film top-down shots of each frame. and a Steinbeck machine to mix to edit in the music. Everything done manually with tape and a cutting board. And then I launched myself out into the industry, a fresh out of the cocoon artist, ready to tackle the industry. And simultaneously, Toy Story was released. And nobody wanted an animator. On top of it, I was immediately gobbled up into the gaming industry. I was immediately swallowed up by the gaming industry because the gaming industry was in desperate need of artists. They weren't necessarily looking for game artists specifically. They just needed people who could draw. And I happened to be at the right place at the right time, so they hired me. And my first jobs right out of school were working on Nintendo games or the original PlayStation games. And it was great. It was fun. But what it did was it pulled me into an industry. It pulled me into a job reality that I had no idea of. And I realized only after my student Marissa had asked me this question, it wasn't until I reflected on that period in my life that I realized I never knew an art career before the gaming industry. The gaming industry was the first industry to employ me. I never got hired directly in an animation studio because everything went 3D and they didn't need 2D animators. And just like we're experiencing right now with artificial intelligence, existential change happened in many, many different ways, especially at the time. To me, the way the world appeared to me as far as the job market was, there were no animation jobs for people like me. I was a junior artist on the market, in a market where there were hundreds if not thousands of layoffs. And if anybody was going to get hired, I was on the bottom of the barrel. There was no chance in hell I would get hired. So not only did I start making that transition into the gaming industry, and I did manage to have a couple of good years in the gaming industry, but my traditional skills, working with pencils and paper, was starting to change as well. I remember when I first started working at a company called A2M, that was also named Behavior. When I first started working there, my first big gaming job in a big studio, I worked on paper with a pencil and a scanner. Everything was scanned, and then that was brought into Photoshop, and we had to color things in using a mouse. Tell me that wasn't a terribly unpleasant experience. I hated that. And all of the line work that we had to do was with a Bezier curve, which was nightmarishly slow and tedious and a pain in the ass. And then one day we were all provided with Wacom tablets, little drawing tablets, tiny little things, blue and gray, navy blue and gray, with a gray pen, if I'm not mistaken. And we had to adapt ourselves to working straight to digital. How did I feel working on a Wacom tablet after I'd spent my entire life learning how to work traditionally on a piece of paper? It was a hard transition for me to make. And there was a bit of a discouraging aspect to the fact that I had learned to master a drawing tool so well that I all of a sudden had to scrap it and let go of that technique, let go of that knowledge that I'd spent years in school, my whole life studying, practicing, mastering. And all of a sudden, nope, now we're doing things on a plastic tablet. I didn't like it at first, but I had it easy. Because imagine how painters felt. Imagine how oil painters like my mother felt, or people who painted, even painting in acrylic. I mean, acrylic is the closest thing to painting digitally, because it's just technically a stain on a canvas or on a surface. But oil painters revel in the thickness, in the viscosity, in the reflectivity, in the way oil paint catches the light and how you can mix mediums. It's a medium in and of itself that's an art form. It has relief to it. It has an identity to the actual thickness of the paint and the technique of the painter. You can see this when you look at a Rembrandt painting, how much he would load that paintbrush and smear it across the surface of a face to capture the oily wrinkles in a forehead. Digital painting didn't have any of that. It was just color on a digital screen. All of a sudden, the medium was starting to die out. Everything started to become digital. And to be completely honest with you, that, to me, was the first domino that has led to where we are today. I don't think the real pain point of artificial intelligence is starting now. I think it started 20 years ago, at the beginning of my career. Because if you think about it, my artwork ceased to be a material on a physical object. My artwork from that point forward became data. Copyable, editable data. Everybody's was. So as far as the chemical makeup of my paints, the wood that I used to stretch my canvas on, the staples that I used to staple my canvas onto the frame, the quality of gesso, the way I mix paint, the way I mix colors, if I glaze or do not glaze, if I use linseed oil or some kind of other kind of paint thinner, that didn't matter anymore. It's just data. It's a stylus and it's data. Now, advantages came with that. More vibrant colors, easier to save and catalog. But as far as the digital stamp on my artwork, it didn't really mean anything. And it's not like I could not sell a digital painting nearly at the same value that I could sell an exclusive, one-of-a-kind painting. I mean, painters had ways of making more money. They could do high-quality giclée prints and maybe even add some smears of paint on top of it to make it feel more like, to give that painting a little bit more relief, to make it feel more like an original. Limited editions that they could increase the value of. But with my work, you could make infinite copies of it. And that's been my reality for the last 20 plus years of my career. I've pretty much worked exclusively digitally. I hung up my drawing pencils decades ago. And you fast forward to where we are today in digital art, and now with artificial intelligence that's stealing this art, that's scraping this data. Because there's no signature to my work, because there's no way to connect my image directly to me apart from you being able to watch my painting process, the skill's there, the experience is there, the expressiveness is there, my identity is in the image that I capture, but it ends there. I got an email, I don't know if it was a spam email or whatever, but I got an email from somebody with a title saying, "You need to read this, this is important." And then the email went on to express the fact that they had some project they were working on that they needed an experienced artist to be able to talk about. But just so you know, Adam, I went onto your website and I copied your image and I easily went into Photoshop and I removed the signature. And then I ran that through an AI training model. And it was so easy, you have no idea. I stole it from your website. We need to talk about this. Now, had I replied to that, which I don't intend to be completely honest with you, it seemed very clickbaity to me and very dramatic, I would have replied, "You didn't need to steal it from my website. You can find my work all over Google. The last 20 years of my artwork has been stealable, and it already has been stolen." So you went through trouble you didn't need to. You could have just Googled me. Yeah, my artwork's on ArtStation, it's on Google, it's all over the internet. Heck, if you need to, you can take a screenshot of one of my YouTube videos. Help yourself. There's nothing I can do about that. At least not yet. But I wasn't impressed by that fact. The physicality of my painting has been data for 20 plus years, as is yours, as is every other artist most of the artists that you adore today. Most of their artwork is just data. It is very stealable. Help yourself. I can't stop you. The only thing standing between my artwork and the thieves up until this point has been the intention and willingness of the person who's stealing it. The empathy and the morality and the ethics of the company that wants to take advantage of my digital artwork. And as we're experiencing right now, you put the right person, or technically the wrong person, in the right or wrong place, and the right tool to be able to steal it in extremely large quantity, and morality and ethics be damned. It's the Wild West. It's a free-for-all. It's a all-you-can-eat free buffet. Go for it. It's very interesting too. I just posted on my community tab, and I recommend you check out my community tab because I very often post important videos or inspiring things there. A TED Talk by a guy who was talking about how the cost of hiring these engineers and hiring these companies and these professionals and these programmers to be able to develop these AI systems and AI models, it's a very, very expensive endeavor. Yet, their entire model is trained on people they don't pay, us, the artists. And I loved his approach to that, talking about how everybody but the people who trained this model have been very well paid, but the artist. And then he goes on to talk about the benefits of licensing and paying these artists for their artwork so that they can opt in and or be paid for the work that they're providing willingly to these companies. And what I found was particularly valuable about this TED Talk is, as much as I very much appreciate the artists like Steve Zapata who have gone up on stage and have done TED Talks of their own, I loved discovering at the end, or at least early on, that the person giving this TED Talk was a person who worked in developing AI models. He actually represented the AI development community, and he was speaking on behalf of the artists. And I think that, to me, was the most touching and valuable part of this conversation, and one which I wish to dig into far more ambitiously moving forward. Up until this point, the artists and the AI companies, just like my mother at the university at the opposite end of the hallway, where one end was all the artists and the other end was all the programmers, right now, you and I, the artist most likely, are standing at one end of the hallway, and way off at the other end of the hallway are geeky programmers who really need to get laid, right? And they're probably standing at the other end of the hallway looking at us saying, stop your whining. Take a bath. Stop, you live in your little fantasy world. This is the real world. And it's funny because anytime I read a comment from somebody who is pro AI in the comments, that's usually the tone. Stop being such a baby. What? The future's here. Adapt to it. Get over it. And that, to me, demonstrates the biggest problem here. It's the vast disconnect between the artist and the programmer. It's the vast disconnect between the people who produce the art and the people who are producing the programming. And what we have yet to do is meet at that crossroads yet. We need to have a conversation together. Because at both ends of this hallway, whether you're an AI development programmer who's working on DALL-E or Stable Diffusion or any of these different programs, and or the artist at the opposite end, what you learn every single time is when you meet in the middle, there's two human beings who both have completely different lives and different realities and different perspectives that have yet to sit down and have a conversation together, to share that space together and say, this is what my reality's like, this is what my reality's like. How do we see things differently and how do we see things the same way? Because up until that point, one of the things that's been getting on my nerves is the fact that programmers have been dehumanized by artists. And you know what? Artists have been dehumanized by programmers. It's an us versus them thing, which to me is always an indication of ignorance. No, nothing positive comes from living in a gated community. And we can't stand here and have any kind of a productive conversation and make any kind of progress if the programmers stay at their end of the hallway and the artists stay at theirs. We need an intermediary. We need a meeting place where we can sit down and have this conversation together. And as we do, we'll start to develop an understanding of the big picture. And by having an understanding of the big picture, by seeing the world through the lens, through that full lens, when we start observing with both eyes open, where we can see twice as well, one eye being the artist, one eye being the engineer, the programmer, the software engineer, it won't be until then that we start to have a clear idea on how to move forward with it, how to understand the other side of the story. Now, when I talk about the computer engineer, the software engineer, I'm not referring to the CEO of ChatGPT or Elon Musk, who doesn't give a fuck because they're not programmers, they're not artists, they're just people who want more money and more power at the cost of anything. No, I'm talking about the humans who are just software developers who, just like us, the artists, need a job. They're just trying to support their families. Have you ever stopped to think for 2 seconds that these AI developers might be, I don't know, single mothers of 3 in their 20s who've been abandoned by their partner, who are just trying to make ends meet, just trying to raise a family? Because they are. There's a lot of those AI developers are single mothers of 3, some of which are probably in fucking diapers, that are just trying to protect their family. They are not the evil mega corporations. They are not the evil villains who are stealing. No, they're just people who are sitting down in an office programming, collecting their paycheck because they went to school and they got a degree in computer science and they're just trying to make a living from it, just like my mother did. Is my mother promoting AI? No, she's an oil painter, for fuck's sakes. Is the fact that she's a programmer make her evil? No, it means she's a well fucking rounded human being who's got both eyes open, and she benefited from having both eyes open, didn't she? So I think that's where we need to go moving forward. We need to stop living in our gated community. I absolutely love Carla Ortiz and Steven Zapata and all of these other artists who have used their platforms, myself included, to help to educate and keep the conversation going about artificial intelligence. But now I think that we've kind of exhausted that resource, and I think it's time for us to start bringing more diversity into the conversation and start to understand this from everybody's perspective, so we understand where everybody stands, so we can start to find creative solutions on how to move forward. Not to the CEOs, but to the people who are developing this software. Get to find out what their perspectives are. And I'm fairly certain that as much as they care how this is affecting people, at least from more of a lifestyle perspective, they too feel just as powerless, and they too have kids that they need to feed, and unfortunately can't indulge quitting their jobs to protect the lives of artists. That's the CEO's job. They're the ones who need to make sacrifices. They're the ones who need to be punished for what they're doing, because they're the ones spearheading all of this bullshit. Now, Marissa also brought up another question. She said, Adam, you're an established artist and you're a YouTuber, as is Kelsey Rodriguez and Tim McBurney and Tyler Edlin and Hardy Fowler and Ahmed Aldoori and Steve Sip, all of these artists. You're all established artists. You're all making a living for yourself. You all have nice studios and nice audio and video equipment and all that kind of stuff, but none of you are making a living only selling art. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into that specific topic. Coming from a young artist, and a lot of other artists, young artists who've mirrored this same feeling, including, I might add, my exactly the same age, 23-year-old illustration graduate, absolute badass artist herself, who illustrates around the clock, like to the point where I'm starting to worry about her health, because the amount of artwork she produces is insane. To that younger audience, at this phase in your life, where you are building your voice, you're developing your brand, you're learning the industry, you're learning your place in society, you're trying to figure out where your artwork's going, how you're going to be able to make a living moving forward as an artist, not only in the ever sufferable career of an artist. I mean, like I told you, the Sargents, the Bouguereaus, the Renoirs, the Degas, the Monets, the Anne Duffs. Since the dawn of time, making a living as an artist has always been an incredible challenge. We can learn a lesson from artists like Sargent. We can learn lessons from artists like Bouguereau. Sargent did not just make a living because all he did was draw technically strong art. No, he made a living because one of his gifts that he combined with art was his ability to empathize the desires of his audience. And when he strayed away from that, it almost cost him his career. I recommend, if you're not aware of this, if you've never heard about this before, the whole controversy around the painting Madame X, one of his most famous paintings. And one of the reasons it's the most famous is because it was the most controversial. A painting of a beautiful young woman, a very beautiful profile wearing a long black silk dress. And if you look online, you'll see a painting of a woman wearing a silk dress, and you might notice that one side of the bodice is seems a little bit off. It's almost as if her dress didn't fit properly on one side, in the chest area. That painting almost cost him his career. Why? Well, because Sargent's clientele, the people who commissioned him, the people who hired him, were people who cared a lot about their status. These were duchesses and dukes. These were aristocrats and politicians and tycoons. These were the wealthy, the upper class. So, because he represented that upper class, his brand was a brand of upper class. And when he painted Madame X, he made the fatal mistake of, first of all, painting somebody who is not a recognized wealthy person of status, but more importantly, the spaghetti strap of her dress on one side was lowered below the shoulder, which was utterly scandalous. That was him lusting over some prostitute, for all they knew. It was the 19th century equivalent of pornography. I might be dramatizing there a little bit, but it was scandalous. No self-respecting, reputable upper-class woman would ever be caught dead being portrayed that way. At least not by Sargent. Modigliani, perhaps, but Sargent, not a chance. And people started to blacklist him because his brand was his opinion. His brand was his clientele. His brand was his ability to make important people feel more important, to capture the likeness in the most idealistic way possible. And that painting tarnished every other painting he had done prior to that. People didn't want to associate with him the same way nobody wants to associate with Elon now that they find out he's some bigot, some fascist. People are burning Teslas, and rightfully so. He frickin' deserves it. But you see the importance of his reputation, but his combined empathy. And that brings us to today. I was an artist. I grew up an artist. I studied animation. And then from animation, I got into video game design. And I got into production design. And very early on in my career, I acclimatized myself to being an artist whose artwork was a service to a bigger production. It was a piece of production work I was a factory worker who pumped out a certain number of units per day for the artistic directors so they could brainstorm on the visual direction of a project. I didn't really enjoy it that much. And it's very interesting. A lot of people don't pay attention to this detail, but somebody in my position does. When I look at artists who've worked in big companies, well-known YouTubers and stuff like that, and I look at the companies that they've worked for and stuff like that, when they're asked, what was it like working for, I don't know, like Guerrilla Games or Blizzard or something like that, they very often go, nah, it was a job. Where all these younger artists are looking at them going, oh my God, I would dream to work at a company like that. They usually reply with, it's just another job. When the novelty wears off, it's just another job. And it's funny how I never hear anybody sound too overly enthusiastic about that. Why not? Because I don't think that video game production and production art in general really hits at the heart of what an artist is and why they became an artist in the first place. Art is about expressiveness. It's about your voice. It's about your story. It's about your vision. And when you reduce a person's vision to a service, to handing them a wrench and saying, I just want you to turn those screws over and over and over again until we're done with you, and when you're done with those screws, we'll give you different screws to work on. That can be very demoralizing after a certain period of time. And this is why the romance of working in the game industry or any production industry in a factory with CEOs and creative directors and art directors and all that kind of stuff can really take the wind out of a lot of artist sales. For designers, on the other hand, they thrive in this type of environment because that's their strength, their versatility, their adaptability. The tool is their passion. To a concept artist, I would argue the expression is their passion. Artists like Fred Rimbaud or Scott Flanders, right? Or Marc Brunet or Trent Kaniuga. These are artists at their core who allied themselves and dedicated themselves to a production that they could get their heart into. Is it a surprise that all of them are independent now, running YouTube channels in their private businesses? Would you argue that Marc Brunet is not a real artist? Would you have the audacity to say something like that? Is Ahmed Aldoori not a real artist? Is Tyler Edlin not a real artist? Am I not a real artist? I've spent my whole life drawing. I was raised by artists. I'm an artist. But is that how I make my living? No, because I too have 3 children to raise. I too have a mortgage to pay. I too have repairs that need to be paid. I too need to buy equipment to be able to make these YouTube videos in the first place. Do you think I could do so sustainably by opening an Etsy shop? Realistically, not a chance. Not even a remote chance of that. Now, am I dissing Etsy? No, I think Etsy has a wonderful purpose. But when you're older and now you're accountable to the lives of others, I'm afraid to tell you, selling your paintings ain't gonna cut it. It never has, and it never will. Unless you're that Fabergé egg named John Singer Sargent. God forbid cameras ever get invented. And I worked in studios. I produced production artwork so I could make a full-time salary, and I did this for decades. And then the last job I had working in a studio was when I worked as a background supervisor for a Disney show called Wander Over Yonder in Ottawa, Canada. And it was a great show, great colleagues, but like I said, work is work. And on top of it, I didn't get to see my family 6 days out of the week because I had to travel to go to stay in Ottawa to do my job. And shortly thereafter, I was given a teaching job at Champlain College, teaching night courses. This was right around the time that my son Lucas was born, my 3rd child. I got a teaching job. And I fell in love with teaching. It was literally, I kid you not, I went from supervising an entire department of highly skilled animators to teaching an illustration course at 8 p.m. twice a week to a classroom of 3. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I've never been fucking happier in my life. I fell in love with teaching. I realized that teaching was in my DNA. I loved being able to repeat the same lesson 16,000 times in a row and getting better at it every single time I taught it. There was an incredible reward in being able to share what I knew with other people, being able to explain things to people in a way that made it click. Even though they've heard it 1,000 times, I had that magic ingredient to make it make sense. And I developed such a bond with these students, these 3 students of mine. It didn't last long. It was just a short period job. It didn't pay particularly well at all. It kind of paid crap. But it unlocked that spark. It set off that spark in my head. And I realized shortly thereafter, it wasn't ironic. It wasn't coincidental that I loved teaching. I was raised by a teacher, by several actually. My grandmother was a teacher. She taught language. My mother was a teacher. She taught at Concordia University herself. I was raised in an ecosystem of teachers, people who communicated like teachers. I realized teaching was in my DNA. It made sense that I was a teacher. The way I communicated made sense as a teacher. And as this is, if I could credit my career in any way to luck, it would be when I decided to go to UB Campus, which was a school at the time that was funded by Ubisoft to help to train artists to work in the gaming industry, either in game design or artistry. And it's no longer funded by UB Campus, so they might have changed the name or they might have even closed at this point. And I walked in, it was pretty empty there. They weren't teaching any classes at the time. And I sat down with one of the administrators, a really amazing woman. We got along extremely well. I really liked her a lot. And I knocked on her door and I asked her, I said, yeah, I'm a professional artist, but I was looking to train, to study a little bit more and up my skills and stuff like that. And she said, yeah, sure, come in. She could see I was an older guy, right? And we sat down and we started to chat. And she said, well, let me see your work. And I showed her my work and she said, Adam? I said, yeah. Have you ever considered teaching? And I said, well, yeah, I actually had a teaching gig recently and I really love teaching. Why do you ask? She goes, well, there's a CEGEP, there's a college nearby that's looking to fill a teaching position in the animation department. And you really look like you know what you're doing. And I said, oh, well, sure. Why not? And she got me in contact with them and I sat down and had an interview at the college, at the CEGEP of Old Montreal, the best school in Montreal. That's just my opinion. You can take that one to your grave. And I sat down with them, with Nadja and Pierre and all these different guys and Dennis. And they asked me some questions about animation, stuff like that. And I taught them a little mock lesson. And they said, you're hired. And I swear to God, I remember the first day I walked into that department. I walked into that classroom with 30, 40 students or so. And I walked into that classroom for the first time as the new teacher with all the students sitting there waiting for me to be introduced to this new teacher, Adam. And I walked into there never having walked a step, having ever been in that classroom before, never having seen these students before. And I walked into that room and I said to myself, and I felt to myself, I'm home. That's the feeling I had. I'm home. I belong here. I mean, I've worked in countless jobs over the years. Director, artist, senior artist, junior artist, the whole bit. I've worked in video games, film, you name it. I walked into that classroom and I found home. And there was zero friction. There was zero discomfort. There was zero adaptation. I taught. I had a wonderful time. I loved every single fucking student in that class. I created such a bond with all of them. If you ever question whether or not your teachers actually do care about you, you have my word. Teachers care deeply about their students. They're family. And my students, all of the students that I taught there, I consider my family. And every student that I teach in my mentorship are my family. Was I selling my paintings? No. There's more to an artist than just selling paintings. Some can. And if you can make a stable, consistent living selling your artwork, making an Etsy shop, selling them in boutiques, opening up a gallery, selling your canvases, making digital prints, going to Comic-Cons, selling your work there, I am 100% behind you. I will, if that works for you and you've got the magic ingredients to be able to do that, then I deeply respect your devotion and your skill, and I wish you the best. And hopefully one day I'll be able to buy a piece from you as well, as a fan. But from my experience, that makes up a smaller proportion of the big picture of all of us artists out there that are trying to make a living for themselves. And from my experience, most of us usually need to combine our skills. I, for instance, combined my skills in traditional drawing and traditional animation and concept art and 3D to get my foot into the door to become an artist in studios who would only hire people if they had 3D experience. And because I had experience in 3D and 2D, that got me hired as an art director, because I could communicate and understand the process of both 2D and 3D artists, which was very rare back then, back in the early 2000s. And then later on in my career, I combined my skill and my expertise with my absolute passion for teaching, and I became an art teacher. And then after that job, that Disney job had passed, and I'd had my experience, I was initiated into the world of teaching, and I had a chance to teach at Champlain College, and then the Cégep of Old Montreal for several years. I decided to start my own online private mentorship, where I could have one-on-one 2-hour calls with my students, and I could dedicate all of my time, that entire class time, to one person, and push my skills and personalize the lessons the way I wished I could have back in the day. An education I wish I could have had. And I expected that business to, most people usually say it takes 2-3 years to get a business up and running. I was booked solid within a month. Is that because I'm so great? No, it's because after decades of trial and error, the stars aligned. And luck favors the prepared, as Edna Mode says. Right? I was in the right place at the right time. It was funny, I was just talking to my girlfriend the other day. I asked her, why did I start a YouTube channel in the first place? She said, it's because you originally started a YouTube channel to teach. My first videos were my voodoo doll tutorial, which I still like to this day, believe it or not. It's still a good video. And then I did a couple of videos on art psychology and different things like that. I created a YouTube channel to teach art. But then I realized shortly thereafter, it wasn't sustainable. I mean, there's only so much content you can cram into a short video. I need to be able to sit down and personalize my teaching to the student. It's not about me just coming up with new things to teach all the time. The student needs to tell me what they need me to teach. I need them to tell me where they are. I need them to show me their work so I can adapt myself to them. In which case, in that scenario, my ability to diversify and grow on my teaching abilities and the value that I can offer artists is limitless. It's as limited as the number of artists that there are out there. And I've yet to ever meet 2 artists that were at all the same. Every artist I meet is utterly different. And I love that. I love being valuable to artists. I love being able to produce my artwork regularly and train my skills to make me a better artist and a better teacher. I love the fact that when I'm developing my own voice as an artist, I'm also helping you to develop yours. My value is multiples more valuable because I'm not just doing it for myself, I'm also doing it for you. So, when a young, aspiring artist who's learning the industry says, I can build an Etsy shop and I made a couple of bucks on my Etsy shop and I have clients, so can you. And it elaborates on that to say that any artist who's selling their marketing skills, selling their mentorship, selling their, ADHD artists' manuals or books, selling their online course are frauds. Does that offend me? No. It just shows that artist doesn't yet have 3 kids to raise. It means they don't have a mortgage yet. It means that they don't have a car to pay for. If they're that good that they can do that, they can raise a family of 3 and pay their bills and eat and all that kind of stuff, fantastic. But understand that that's far rarer the situation. Usually artists need to learn to diversify themselves, diversify their skills, maybe find multiple sources of income, like Kelsey Rodriguez talks about all the time, that she wrote about in her book, which, by the way, kicks ass. It's a really, really good book, full of very sound advice. Advice I wish I had access to when I was some kid out of animation school who didn't know his ass from his elbow. You have to decide for yourself which way to go. You have to decide for yourself. You have to experiment with your own life and your own skills and find that niche where you can make your own stars align. I can't do that for you. So any of you out there that are working on that, if you have a goal, if you're producing, if you're making a comic book for the first time and you're not getting paid to do it, you don't even know anything about publishing, if you're building an Etsy shop, or if you're building up a gallery of artwork so that you can sell it at an event, and you're working on prints, go, do it. Sargent and Bouguereau thought they had it figured out in the 1800s until photography came around. Some quit, some died, some continued, some adapted. Then the 1970s came around. A young, educated single mother of 3 with a fine arts degree decided to go back to school and get a computer science degree and made a living and had a lot of success and raised a family with that. And now she's back to painting full time. And a young man in his 20s started his career, got it upended when technology came in and turned everything upside down, and he had to find ways to adapt to his current situation and learn 3D and learn After Effects and Flash and whatever stupid fucking software I had to learn just to keep my head above water. But I did it. I had to do what I had to do. I had to adapt, and had I listened to my mother, I probably would have done something very different and wouldn't be where I am today. You have to adapt yourself to your reality. And every artist I've ever had the honor of working with have a unique reality. The only skill that I encourage all of you to have in the face of uncertain economy, in the face of a lack of transparency and communication between AI programmers, software engineers, and artists whose artwork is currently being stolen by big corporations, to artists who are young and trying to build your own Etsy shops or kiosks or boutiques or prints, is stay aware of the fact that one of the greatest skills you can ever learn as an artist, and you will continue to have to learn until the day you die, it's a lesson I continue to learn to this day, is stay open-minded and adaptable. Adapt. Humans are not finite. Humans are evolutions. We are adaptations. And the world will continue to change. And if you don't have any flexibility of mind, you will have a brittle personality and you will quit the minute things change. And my advice to you is don't quit. Grow. Adapt. Be wise. You're going to be just fine. Okay? With that said, I love you all with all my heart. And happy painting. Take care.